On a stressful day, the housekeeper cleaning a millionaire's mansion, considered cold and arrogant by everyone, had to take her son to work because no one in her family could look after the child. But just one moment of distraction, and she lost track of the child in that huge mansion. Her heart started pounding, and she began searching every corner of the house until at one point she decided to go to the millionaire's office to ask if he had seen the baby anywhere. When he opened the office door, she saw something that changed everything. The cold Chicago rain fell without mercy, transforming the late afternoon into a watercolor of grays and street lamp glows. Eliana clutched her young son tightly to her chest, feeling the warmth of his small body through her thin coat. The scent of wet earth and asphalt clung to her clothes, a stark contrast to the aroma that enveloped her the moment the mansion's service door opened. Inside, the air was different, a dense blend of polished wood, fresh lilies, and an expensive perfume that seemed to float like golden dust. The marble foyer gleamed so brightly it reflected the crystal chandelier's lights like an inverted starry sky. It was a world apart, a universe where the rain outside dared not enter. Leo, her 3-year-old boy, snored softly on her shoulder, oblivious to the tension that stiffened his mother's muscles. The neighborhood daycare, a sanctuary of colorful walls and children's laughter, had been padlocked that morning, a faded sign announcing a staff strike. There had been no warning, just the harsh reality knocking at her door. Losing a day's work wasn't an option. The overdue gas bill and the promise of a spot at the more expensive daycare next door weighed heavily on her mind. Bringing him along was the only way, an act of silent desperation. She walked on tiptoes, as if the sound of her boots might shatter the harmony of the place. In the service corridor, a polished metal plaque with elegant dark letters coldly declared the rule. Children strictly forbidden. Each word was a small stab in her chest. Mrs. Albright, the housekeeper who commanded the staff with the precision of a general and the subtlety of an anvil, materialized from the shadows of a half-open door. Her eyes, small and calculating, scanned Eliana from head to toe, lingering on the small, sleeping bundle in her arms. Without a word, she simply pointed her index finger at the plaque. Then, in a clear, cutting voice, she read aloud, "Children strictly forbidden." Humiliation burned Eliana's face, hotter than any fever. She felt the gazes of the other staff, looks of pity and relief that they weren't in her shoes. "The daycare closed, ma'am." There was no warning, Eliana whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Mrs. Albright sighed, a theatrical sound of annoyance. "Just for today, Eliana. And let it be clear, this will come at a price." Eliana nodded, swallowing her pride along with the lump in her throat. She set up her cleaning cart in the most discreet corner she could find, spreading a blanket on the floor for Leo to play with his 2 plastic cars. The boy, now awake, seemed fascinated by the gleaming floor, silently sliding his toys across the smooth surface. Eliana worked with contained urgency, her eyes fixed on the floor she scrubbed, but her mind always attentive to her son. Time dragged on, measured by the imposing tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the main hall. The sound echoed through the silent house, a metronome for her anxiety. Then, her cell phone vibrated in her apron pocket, a short message from her neighbor, Maria. "Hey, I might be able to pick up Leo later if the rain lets up." A glimmer of hope. Eliana looked up to smile at her son, but the corridor was empty. The blanket, the 2 cars, everything was there, but Leo wasn't. The cleaning cart groaned as she leaned on it. The clock's tick-tock seemed to scream in her ears. Her heart hammered like a frightened bird against her ribs. The mansion, with its endless corridors and mirrored doors that multiplied her solitude, suddenly felt like a labyrinth. No one on the staff seemed to notice her panic. Everyone continued their tasks, pretending not to see. "Leo?" she called, her voice a thread. She ran upstairs, her legs shaky, despair rising in her throat. Each closed door was a new wave of terror. She pushed open the heavy office door and her body froze. The image before her was so improbable it seemed like a dream. In the immense dark leather armchair sat him, the boss, the millionaire everyone called a man of stone, and he wasn't alone. Asleep in his lap, breathing calmly and deeply, was Leo, the man whose expression was always an impenetrable mask of coldness, had a relaxed, almost serene face. Eliana stood motionless, squeezing the rubber gloves in her sweat-damp hands, unable to move or speak. The sound that escaped Eliana's lips was an involuntary whisper, her son's name, Leo. It was enough. The millionaire's eyes, Arthur's, opened slowly, without the startle she expected. There was a momentary confusion in his gaze, which quickly transformed into his usual mask of control. He didn't look at her, but at the boy asleep on his chest. With a delicacy that seemed out of place in his large, firm hands, he adjusted the small blanket he had improvised with his own suit jacket, and then, almost without realizing it, a low, melodic sound escaped his lips. He was humming a lullaby, a simple, sweet melody Eliana knew like the back of her hand. It was the same song her grandmother used to sing, a tune born in the backyards of working-class neighborhoods, amidst clotheslines and the comforting scent of Sunday roasts. The shock of that melody, in that place, coming from that man, was like a small short circuit in her mind. What would a man whose fortune was counted in stocks and investments dare to know about the lullabies of her neighborhood? The melody died as suddenly as it began. Arthur stood up, transferring Leo to Eliana's arms with calculated efficiency. The warmth of the moment vanished, replaced by the usual coldness. "Mrs. Albright," he called, his voice echoing down the corridor. The housekeeper appeared in seconds, her face a canvas of false solicitude. "Prepare a formal written warning for the employee," he ordered, without looking at Eliana. "The house rule is clear and non-negotiable. Children are not permitted. Next time, it will be termination for cause." Eliana felt the paper in her hands, the printed letters seeming to dance before her eyes. She signed where she was told, her pride crumbling to dust. She needed that job. She needed the money to pay for the new daycare, to keep a roof over their heads. The dilemma tore her apart. Be the strong woman she always was, or accept the humiliation imposed by the man who, for a brief instant, had blurred the lines of their humanity. The days that followed were heavy. Mrs. Albright watched her with a predator's eyes, every move scrutinized. The mansion, which had once been just a workplace, became hostile territory. One morning, while cleaning the corridor near the pantry, Eliana overheard a technician talking to the cook. "The update will take about 2 days. The first floor cameras will loop, recording over old footage. I've noted everything in the service log, as the boss requested." He flipped through a clipboard, his pen making a firm mark on the paper. Eliana paid no attention, focused on removing a stubborn stain from the baseboard. Little did she know that the seed of a storm had just been planted. Mrs. Albright, who also heard the conversation from her office, smiled discreetly. The partial camera blackout was the opportunity she had been waiting for. She started with poisonous whispers in the corners, planting doubt. "The boss seems so worried lately," she told one of the maids. "He's been rummaging through the office drawers." The gossip spread like a silent virus through the staff, creating an atmosphere of distrust. Eliana felt the stares on her, the conversations that ceased when she approached. Injustice burned in her chest, a painful, live coal. She, who had never taken so much as a paperclip from that house, was now the center of a nameless suspicion. The final blow came in the late afternoon. Passing through the main corridor, she heard Mrs. Albright's voice, deliberately loud, so Eliana would hear, "It's a shame. There was some cash in there for emergencies." Mr. Arthur's wallet simply vanished from his office desk. The housekeeper paused dramatically, her eyes meeting Eliana's for a fraction of a second. Just today, when the cameras aren't working properly, the accusation, though unspoken, hung in the air like toxic smoke, suffocating Eliana with every corridor she cleaned. The glances from her co-workers were a mix of pity and distance. No one wanted to be contaminated by suspicion. She worked in an almost monastic silence, focusing on the repetitive motion of the mop, the soap suds, anything to distract her from the cold knot in her stomach. Every creak of a door made her jump, expecting the final confrontation, the firing that would leave her utterly adrift. The humiliation was an open wound, and the worst part was the powerlessness. How could she prove her innocence when the very lack of proof was used against her? Her word, a cleaner's, against the housekeepers who had served the family for years. The scales of justice, she knew, tipped dangerously towards wealth and power. The resolution of the drama came as theatrically as its beginning. Mrs. Albright, with unnecessary fuss, asked a maid to help her clean a large ceramic vase in the hall. "This dust is giving me allergies," she exclaimed, her voice loud enough to echo. And then, the perfectly rehearsed cry of surprise, "My God, what's this behind here?" With her fingertips, as if touching something dirty, she pulled the leather wallet from behind the vase. What a miracle! It appeared. Her eyes flashed in Eliana's direction, who was polishing a glass table a few feet away. Perhaps someone regretted it and returned it out of fear, wouldn't you say? The insinuation was a knife. Eliana felt the blood rush to her face, but remained motionless, the polishing cloth clenched in her hand. Minutes later, she was summoned to the office. Arthur sat behind his imposing mahogany desk, the wallet before him. He didn't seem angry, just tired. "Mrs. Albright told me the wallet was found," he said, his voice neutral. Eliana just nodded, her heart pounding. "I don't know how it got there, sir. I didn't." He interrupted her with a gesture. "I know it wasn't you." The words hit her with the force of a wave, a relief so immense that her legs weakened. He continued, his tone pragmatic and cold as ever. "I'm about to announce a major philanthropic partnership. The last thing I need is a domestic scandal, no matter how small. It could affect my company's image, compromise investments, and the trust of important donors." He was defending his assets, not her. The realization was a bucket of cold water. "Your record is clean, Eliana, and Mrs. Albright's word sometimes is excessively dramatic," he admitted, in a rare moment of sincerity. "Therefore, the matter is closed." Eliana's relief, however, was short-lived. He pushed a new document across the table. It was a second written warning. However, the whole situation arose from an initial rule breach, yours. This serves as a formal record that any slip-up, any at all, will result in your immediate termination. It was a small victory at an enormous cost. She was cleared of the theft accusation, but now walked an even thinner tightrope. She signed the paper, her hand trembling slightly. She was free, but chained. The first week of work ended with a surprise. Arthur gathered the entire staff in the dining room. He announced that in 2 Saturdays, there would be a large charity gala at the mansion to launch his new foundation. There will be a need for extra staff for organization and cleaning during the event. Hours will be paid double. A ripple of murmurs went through the group. For many, it was a chance to earn much-needed extra money. Eliana, thinking of the gas bill and the new daycare, felt a spark of hope. She needed that money. As she raised her hand to volunteer, her eyes met Mrs. Albright's. The housekeeper watched her with a thin, enigmatic smile, a smile that promised nothing good. In that instant, Eliana realized the gala wouldn't just be a party, it would be a stage, and the housekeeper was already setting the scene for her next trap. The second week began with a strange convergence of worlds. Eliana discovered, by chance, during a conversation in the pantry, that the major social project Arthur was launching was focused on renovating daycares in low-income neighborhoods. The pilot project, the calling card of his entire philanthropic endeavor, would be carried out exactly at the unit Leo attended before the strike. The coincidence was so improbable it bordered on absurd, but life, she knew, sometimes wrote strange scripts. Suddenly, Eliana was no longer just the silent cleaner who knew the best products for marble. She knew every crack in that daycare's floor, the chronic leak in the kitchen, the window that wouldn't close properly in the nursery. She knew the teachers by name, the mothers, the grandmothers. She was a living, pulsing bridge between Arthur's capital and the community he intended to help. The dynamic in the mansion subtly shifted. Architects and social workers began to frequent the house, and Arthur, to everyone's surprise, requested Eliana participate in some meetings. He needed practical information, details no blueprint could provide. Where do the children most like to play in the yard? What's the cook's biggest daily challenge? Eliana, initially shy, soon found herself speaking with authority and passion, her voice firm as she described the needs of that place that was an extension of her home. Her visibility grew, and with it, Mrs. Albright's envy deepened. The housekeeper, who had always wanted her invisible, now had to watch her rise as an informal consultant, an important cog in her boss's machine. The first site visit to the daycare was a shock of realities. Arthur arrived in his imported sedan, his impeccable suit clashing with the potholed asphalt and graffitied walls. Under the strong midday sun, the smell of street food from the local market mingled with the aroma of coffee and cake that the local church group had prepared to receive the entourage. Eliana felt at home, greeting neighbors, laughing with the daycare cooks. Arthur, on the other hand, seemed like a fish out of water, displaced amidst that warm and noisy simplicity. Trying to break the ice, he struck up a conversation with one of the parents about the local high school football team. To everyone's astonishment, he began to hum a snippet of the team's fight song, a tune only those who had frequented the cement bleachers of the local stadium would know. It was another one of those small shocks, another loose piece in the puzzle of that man, indicating roots much simpler than his multi-million-dollar net worth let on. Amidst this fragile rapprochement, panic set in. One of Arthur's team volunteers, a well-meaning young man, offered Leo a peanut butter cookie. Eliana didn't see it in time. In minutes, the boy's skin began to break out in hives. His breathing became labored, an allergic reaction, quick and terrifying. Chaos erupted around them, people screaming for help. But it was Arthur who acted, pale, but with an unsettling calm. He ran to his car. Eliana, with Leo in her arms, saw him open the glove compartment. Inside, perfectly organized, was a complete first aid kit, including an EpiPen for anaphylactic shock. He had briefly shown it to her when he gave her a ride to the daycare earlier, commenting it was a precaution. Now, the word took on a different weight. He administered the medication with a precision not learned from office manuals. Eliana realized, with cutting clarity, that this calm didn't come from training, but from experience. He had lived this before, that shared vulnerability, the fear of losing a child, created an invisible and powerful bond between them. But this same bridge that united them also opened a door to a new and powerful threat. The door opened with the arrival of a woman who looked like she'd stepped off a magazine cover. Tall, elegant, with a smile as polished as the jewels she wore. It was Veronica, Arthur's ex-fiancée. Her reappearance wasn't a coincidence, but a cold and calculated strategy. She wasn't driven by sentiment, but by business. With news of the philanthropic foundation gaining media traction, Veronica saw an opportunity. She represented a consortium of European investors, and Arthur's image as a benevolent billionaire was key to closing lucrative contracts. To secure these funds, your image needs to be impeccable, darling. No domestic scandals, no loose ends, she told him, her voice of velvet filled with thorns, during an office conversation Eliana overheard by chance passing down the corridor. Veronica's eyes swept the house and its staff with thinly veiled contempt. To her, people like Eliana were inconvenient presences, smudges on the perfect canvas she wanted to paint for the press and business partners. She promised a substantial donation to the foundation, an amount that would accelerate the renovation of dozens of daycares. But the offer came with an implicit condition, whispered in corners and exchanged in glances with Mrs. Albright, the discreet removal of certain elements. In clear, cold terms, she wanted Eliana fired. The proximity between the boss and the cleaner, his dependence on her information about the daycare, all of this was a threat to the control Veronica wished to exert over Arthur's public image. Arthur hesitated. Firing Eliana now, the woman who was key to the success of his pilot project, would be shooting himself in the foot. But the pressure from Veronica and the millions at stake was immense. Mrs. Albright, for her part, silently thrilled. Her new ally was powerful and shared her goal. The siege around Eliana was tightening. Wounded in her pride, hearing the whispers and feeling the growing hostility, Eliana made a decision. She wouldn't be a victim. She wouldn't depend on Arthur's pity or her antagonist's moods. She would begin to gather proof of her own integrity, brick by brick. She remembered the technician and the maintenance log. One afternoon, when the pantry was empty, she found the clipboard on top of a cabinet. With her heart pounding, she leafed through the pages until she found the date of the wallet incident. There it was, in the technician's hasty handwriting. Camera system maintenance, first floor. Cameras C03 to C07 on 15-minute loop between 2 p.m. and 6 p.m. She pulled her cell phone from her pocket and photographed the page. It was her first weapon. The second came from a conversation with her neighbor, Maria. "Friend, you need to protect yourself. They're rich. They can invent anything." Maria then handed her an old object, slightly yellowed by time, a baby monitor. "It's an old one, but the microphone is powerful. It picks up sound from a distance. I used it when my boy slept in the back room. Keep it in your apron pocket. Turned on, you might catch something." Eliana, at first, balked. It seemed like something out of a soap opera, a movie. But fear was greater than embarrassment. She began to carry the small device, a silent secret amidst the cleaning products. The second week of work was drawing to a close when the first major piece of evidence fell into her hands. A beverage supplier for the charity gala sent an email to the house administration, attaching a small cell phone video to prove a delivery error. The video, shaky and poor quality, showed the mansion's service entrance, and there, in the background, for a fraction of a second, a blurry but unmistakable image. Mrs. Albright, on the exact day the wallet disappeared, discreetly tampering with Eliana's cleaning cart. The image didn't prove what she had done, but it proved she had lied when she said she hadn't approached Eliana's belongings that day. It was a crack, a fissure in the wall of lies. Arthur, upon seeing the video, shelved the idea of termination, but Veronica's pressure made him impose a new, even harsher condition. The rule will be absolute. No children, ever again, under no circumstances. I don't want any more risks. Eliana went back to walking long, tiring blocks every day to drop Leo off with Maria. The fine Chicago rain began to fall again, cold and persistent. The streets gleamed under the streetlights, slippery and dangerous. The mansion, with its central heating and imperturbable silence, seemed more distant and unattainable than ever. The third week began under the weight of an overwhelming routine. The fine, icy rain had become a constant companion on Eliana's long walks to Maria's house. Every morning before sunrise, she wrapped Leo in the thickest blanket she had, adjusted him in her arms, and headed out into the dark, silent street. The weight of her son, once a comfort, Now added to the bone-deep weariness she felt, each step on the slippery sidewalk was an effort, a battle against the biting wind that seemed to find every gap in her coat. She arrived at the mansion with aching shoulders and damp clothes, exchanging the smell of ozone and wet asphalt for the dry, perfumed air of a world that knew no cold. The transition was brutal and made her feel even more out of place, an odd piece in that machinery of luxury and perfection. The wealth of that place wasn't just in the objects, but in the comfort, the absence of effort, something that for her was an unimaginable luxury. Veronica and Mrs. Albright watched her daily struggle with thinly veiled satisfaction. Sitting in the heated pantry, with steaming cups of coffee in their hands, they planned the details of the charity gala. But their eyes often drifted to Eliana's tired figure passing down the corridor. "It's remarkable the resilience of some people," Veronica commented, with a tone that mixed false astonishment and deep contempt. "But we can't risk it. The gala is crucial. The investors I'm bringing are sensitive to image. Any noise, any problem, could compromise the capital flow we want to attract for the foundation and Arthur's other businesses." Mrs. Albright agreed with a nod. "Mr. Arthur's assets must be protected at all costs. And his image is his most valuable asset right now. Don't worry, I have everything under control." The housekeeper's control began to materialize in the form of an immense roll, delivered by a specialized transport company. 4 strong men were needed to carry the Persian rug into the mansion. It wasn't just a decorative item, it was a work of art, a family heirloom whose monetary value was obscene. Each silk thread seemed to have been dyed with gold. "This rug will be the centerpiece of the ballroom," Mrs. Albright announced to the cleaning staff, her eyes fixed on Eliana. "It absolutely cannot be stained. Cleaning the ballroom will be your responsibility, Eliana. Use the special wax, the one with the blue label. I want this floor shining like a mirror to welcome this treasure." The order was clear, the threat veiled. Eliana looked at the unrolled rug and saw no beauty. She saw a minefield, a chasm of responsibility that could swallow her whole at the slightest misstep. That object was worth more than she would earn in a lifetime of work. It was another piece in that universe of goods and possessions that made her feel small, disposable. Anxiety again tightened its grip on her chest, the feeling of walking a tightrope, now with an abyss of silk and gold threads beneath her feet. The gala was approaching, and with it, the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. The trap was being set, piece by piece, and she was the target. That night, long after the other employees had left, Mrs. Albright silently descended to the cleaning supply closet. The smell of chlorine and disinfectant hung in the air. Her eyes scanned the organized shelves, stopping at 2 almost identical bottles. One contained the special liquid wax for wooden floors, with a blue label, which gave a dry, protective sheen. The other, of the same color and shape, contained an oil-based cleaner used for outdoor areas, dangerously slippery and capable of permanently staining noble wood. With a slow and deliberate movement, she swapped the labels. A thin, cruel smile curved her lips in the gloom. She left the tampered bottle right at the front, within easy reach. The bait was set. The day for preparing the grand ballroom dawned grey and oppressive, a reflection of Eliana's state of mind. The tension in the mansion was palpable, and electricity running beneath the apparent luxury and calm. The Persian rug, still rolled, rested in the center of the hall like a sleeping monarch, waiting to reign over the noble wooden floor. For Eliana, that object was the epicenter of her anxiety. Cleaning that floor, under Mrs. Albright's watchful eye, was like disarming a ticking time bomb. The schedule was tight. The decorators would arrive in a few hours to install the rug and begin the final setup for the gala. Any delay would be unforgivable. She pushed her cleaning cart into the empty ballroom, the sound of the wheels echoing in the vastness of the high ceiling. The smell of old wood and fine dust greeted her. There she was, a small figure in a grand space, responsible for preparing the stage for the display of a fortune she could barely conceive. In the supply closet, she picked up the bottle of wax with the blue label, exactly as Mrs. Albright had instructed. It was at the front, easy to grab. For a moment, weariness compelled her to simply begin the work, to immerse herself in the mechanical routine that anesthetized her fear. But something made her stop, an instinct, a silent voice in her mind, sharpened by distrust. She opened the bottle. The scent that rose wasn't the soft, familiar aroma of carnauba wax. It was a chemical, oily, penetrating odor, the smell of a garage, not a luxury parlor. Her heart skipped a beat. She shook the bottle, and the liquid inside seemed denser, less fluid than normal. Doubt morphed into alarm. Sabotage. The word exploded in her mind. With trembling hands, she returned to the ballroom. She needed to be sure. In a hidden corner, behind a heavy velvet curtain that brushed the floor, she dampened the tip of a cloth with the product and wiped a small, invisible area of the flooring. The result was instant and disastrous. The wood darkened immediately, absorbing the oil and forming a dark, slippery stain. If she had applied that to the entire ballroom, the floor would have been ruined forever. The damage would have been incalculable, irreparable harm to the family's assets. Termination for cause would be the least of her worries. Terror chilled her spine, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, lucid anger. She ran back to the supply closet. She frantically searched for the correct bottle, the real one. She found it at the back of a shelf, hidden behind other products. She returned to the ballroom and, with a feverish urgency, first cleaned the small test stain, praying it wouldn't leave a trace. Then she began to wax the entire immense ballroom with the correct product, working at a speed she didn't know she possessed. Every muscle in her body screamed with effort, sweat streaming down her forehead and mixing with silent tears of anger and relief. Time flew. When she finally finished, the floor shone with a perfect, dry luster, ready for the rug. But she was terribly late. At the exact moment she was giving the final polish, the ballroom door opened. Mrs. Albright entered, followed by Veronica. The housekeeper looked at the clock on the wall, then at Eliana, and a smile of pure, malicious triumph creased her lips. "Running late, Eliana," she said, her voice sharp as broken glass. "The decorating team has been waiting in the corridor for 15 minutes. An event of this magnitude, with so many investments at stake, does not tolerate this kind of failure. Performance is everything in this house." The humiliation hit her squarely. In front of the woman who most wished for her downfall, Eliana looked at the impeccable floor, the work that had saved a fortune, and was being publicly reprimanded for incompetence. She stood there, paralyzed, the smell of oil still on her hands, the evidence of the crime on her cart, but unable to utter a single word. The public reprimand left a bitter taste in Eliana's mouth, a mix of anger and frustration. She swallowed the injustice once again and retreated into the shadows of the service corridor as the team of decorators invaded the ballroom. She watched from afar as the rug was unrolled with almost surgical care, a wave of silk and colors covering the floor she had saved. The small victory, however, brought no relief, only a new burden. Every glance Mrs. Albright cast her way was charged with an animosity that had lost all subtlety. It was a declared war, silent and relentless. Eliana felt like an acrobat on a barbed wire tightrope, every movement calculated to avoid a fall, while her adversaries shook the rope with pleasure. In the days leading up to the gala, Veronica's presence at the mansion became constant. She supervised every detail, from the flower arrangements to the polishing of the silverware, always with an air of authority that surpassed Mrs. Albright's. Her true intention, however, was to monitor Arthur. She followed him through the corridors, discussing press strategies, guest lists, and most importantly, the importance of projecting an image of strength and control. Markets are sensitive, Arthur. The stock market reacts to any sign of instability. Your shareholders, your partners, everyone needs to see an unshakable leader, not a philanthropist distracted by domestic problems, she said, her voice low and persuasive. The word problems was always uttered with a quick glance in Eliana's direction. The pressure seemed to work. Arthur became more distant, his usual coldness now tinged with palpable impatience. The brief interactions he'd had with Eliana about the daycare ceased. He passed her in the hallways as if she were part of the furniture, his eyes focused on some horizon of business and figures she couldn't reach. For Eliana, this distance was more painful than any accusation. That glimpse of humanity she had seen, the man who sang lullabies and knew the panic of a child's allergy, seemed to have been locked away again behind 7 keys. The mansion, which for a brief period seemed to have a warm spot, returned to being a frozen labyrinth. Amidst this oppressive atmosphere, Eliana's only source of comfort was the baby monitor in her pocket. The small device, overlooked by most, became her ears. While cleaning the library, she accidentally left it on a stack of books as she went to fetch another product. From the corridor, she heard Veronica's voice, clear and distinct, coming from the small receiver. She was on the phone. "No, don't worry about the capital. The profitability of this deal will offset any donation. Arthur is hesitating, but he knows he needs me to secure the European funds. The gold is in the image, and I am the best goldsmith he can find." Eliana picked up the receiver, her heart pounding. It was a power play, and the foundation, the daycare, the children were merely pawns on the board. The emotional turning point, however, came from an unexpected source. On the eve of the gala, while cleaning silverware in the back kitchen, Arthur suddenly entered. He looked exhausted, his tie loosened, his hair slightly disheveled. He didn't see her immediately. He went to the refrigerator, took a bottle of water, and stood with his back to her, looking out the window at the rain beginning to fall. "They think it's easy," he muttered to himself, his voice low and laden with a weight she had never heard before. To think that money, that net worth, solves everything, that all it takes is signing a check. He turned, and his eyes met hers. For the first time, there was no mask, no coldness. There was only a deep and overwhelming vulnerability. "My grandfather was a carpenter," he said, as if needing to confess something. "He taught me that a man's worth isn't in the assets he accumulates, but in what he builds with his own hands." He looked at his own hands, large and well-kept, and then at Eliana's, red and marked by work. The chasm between them never seemed so vast, and at the same time, so insignificant. The eve of the gala transformed the mansion into a buzzing hive of frantic activity. Florists came and went with armfuls of orchids and white lilies. The catering team set up workstations in the back kitchen, and lighting technicians discreetly ran cables through corners. The air vibrated with an energy of expectation, a hum of expensive and meticulous preparations. Amidst it all, Eliana moved like a ghost, her presence functional and invisible to most. Her mind, however, wasn't on the shine she gave to the brass railings, but on Arthur's unexpected confession. His words about his carpenter grandfather had opened a small crack in his armor, revealing a man in conflict with his own fortune, a billionaire who perhaps felt as out of place in his world of luxury as she did. This perception didn't lessen the distance between them, but made it more complex, more human. She felt a strange and dangerous empathy for him, the man who had signed her warnings and who now seemed a prisoner of his own business empire and expectations. Veronica, on the other hand, navigated the chaos with the authority of a queen in her palace. She didn't see the beauty of the flowers, but the impact they would have on social columnists, photos. She didn't see the taste of the canapes, but the seal of approval they would bring from her influential guests. Every detail was an investment in Arthur's image, an asset she intended to manage to maximize her own profit. She and Mrs. Albright exchanged complicit glances. Small visual cues Eliana had learned to recognize. The housekeeper seemed energized by the presence of her new ally, her posture more erect, her tone of voice more imperious. The trap, Eliana felt, was about to close. The opportunity the two had been waiting for arose in the middle of the afternoon. One of the wine boxes, poorly stacked, tipped over in the storage room, spilling a dark, sticky puddle on the concrete floor. Mrs. Albright immediately called Eliana. "Clean this, and quickly. Use the strong solvent, the one in the red bottle, and be careful not to damage the other labels." The task was deliberately ungrateful and time-consuming. Eliana grabbed the products and, so as not to stain the clean apron she would wear later, took it off and left it folded on an empty crate right at the entrance of the storage room. In the apron pocket, small and forgotten, was the base unit of the baby monitor, still on purely out of habit. She worked with her back to the door, scrubbing the floor hard, the smell of the solvent filling the air. It was then that she heard Veronica's voice, low and hissing, coming from the corridor. "Albright, here." The housekeeper entered the storage room, closing the door behind her. They were a few feet from Eliana's apron. "That scare with the rug wasn't enough," Veronica said, impatience sharpening her voice. "I need a definitive solution. Tomorrow, during the gala. The journalists will be here, my investment partners too. I need Arthur to look brilliant and unattainable, not the protector of some mere cleaner." She paused. "Resolve this. I'll offer you a generous sum. Think of it as a bonus, a dividend for your loyalty. Enough money to ensure a comfortable retirement." Mrs. Albright's silence lasted only a second. "What's the plan?" she asked, her voice choked with greed. "Simple," Veronica replied. "The silverware. It's a family heirloom, his mother's treasure. During dinner, you will publicly accuse her of having used the wrong product, of having irreversibly stained the pieces. Create an incident that looks like pure incompetence. In front of everyone, he will have no choice but to fire her for performance. It will be clean, quick, and indisputable." Eliana, on the other side of the shelf, stood motionless, the solvent-soaked cloth in her hand. Her heart seemed to have stopped beating. She heard the door open and close. When she turned around, the storage room was empty. Trembling, she walked to the crate and picked up her apron. The small baby monitor receiver, which she kept clipped to her belt, crackled faintly. With a trembling finger, she brought it to her ear. The whispered conversation, the cruel and detailed plan, was all there, recorded in the device's tiny memory. The day of the gala dawned with a leaden sky, a harbinger of the storm brewing on the horizon, and within Eliana. The mansion was a whirlwind of controlled activity. In the main ballroom, steam from irons rose from white linen tablecloths. The scent of rosemary and butter wafted from the kitchen. In the garden, yellow lights, delicate as fireflies, were hung from tree branches, a promise of magic against the encroaching gloom. Eliana polished the silverware in the pantry, piece by piece. Each fork, each knife seemed to weigh a ton in her hands. It wasn't the weight of the metal, but that of the trap they represented. In her apron pocket, the small baby monitor receiver was a warm and dangerous secret. She had the proof, the weapon that could destroy Mrs. Albright and Veronica, but fear paralyzed her. How and when to use it? An accusation at the wrong moment could easily be dismissed as the fantasy of a desperate employee. She needed to wait for the attack, to let them expose themselves, but the waiting was torture. The first guests began to arrive, a flow of silk, expensive perfumes, and conversations that floated through the air like champagne bubbles. These were men and women who lived in a parallel universe, where worries were measured by stock market fluctuations or the profitability of their hedge funds. From her discreet post, Eliana heard fragments of dialogues about the Dow Jones, about deals closed in tax havens, and about the cash flow of multinational corporations. It was a world moved by capital she would never touch, a reality as distant as the moon. Arthur was at the center of it all, the perfect host. He moved with natural elegance, his dark suit falling impeccably on his shoulders. The vulnerable man from the kitchen had disappeared, replaced by the unattainable billionaire Veronica wanted to sell to the world. He smiled, shook hands, his voice calm and confident as he discussed projects and investments. Eliana watched him from afar and felt a chill of doubt. Would that man listen to her? Or would he dismiss her as a small inconvenience on his night of triumph? Veronica was radiant beside him, a panther in a red dress, whispering names and information in his ear, managing his image with the precision of a stockbroker. Her eyes met Eliana's for an instant, and in them was a glint of contempt and anticipated victory. Mrs. Albright, for her part, commanded the team of waiters with imperceptible gestures, her face a mask of professionalism that barely concealed her satisfaction. The trap was set, and all the actors were in their places. It was then that nature decided to intervene in the script. A distant thunderclap, at first muffled by the orchestra's music, sounded closer, then another, stronger. The wind outside began to howl, whipping the rain against the immense glass windows. The garden lights flickered once, twice. Inside the mansion, the crystal chandelier lights trembled, and then, with one last violent flash that illuminated the ballroom for a fraction of a second, everything plunged into darkness. A collective gasp of surprise was followed by a tense silence. The emergency lights flickered on, bathing the ballroom in a weak, ghostly glow. In the midst of the confusion, at the service door leading to the kitchen, a soaking wet figure appeared. It was Maria, holding a small blue jacket. "Eliana," she called, her voice almost inaudible. "The driver got lost in the rain, stopped at the wrong gate. Leo forgot his jacket. He'll get cold." In the chaos of the blackout, with guests moving disoriented and staff rushing, the boy, scared by the dark and the noise, let go of his mother's hand. He slipped between the legs of the guests, a small blur attracted by the emergency lights flickering in the main corridor. The cold, familiar panic surged through Eliana's body again. She heard Maria shout her son's name, a sound that was lost in the confusion. Leo had disappeared again, this time in the heart of the party, at the exact moment she was most vulnerable. The panic that rose in Eliana's throat was an old and familiar poison, but this time, something was different. The memory of that first rainy night, of Leo sleeping safely in Arthur's lap, acted as an anchor amidst her internal storm. She took a deep breath, forcing air into lungs that seemed to have shrunk. Instead of running blindly through the corridors, she stopped. She closed her eyes for an instant in the dimly lit ballroom and concentrated. The chaos around her, the frightened murmurs of the guests, the hurried footsteps of the staff, the howl of the wind outside became background noise. She needed to listen. She needed to hear the silence, the sound that didn't belong to the party. And then, almost imperceptible, fainter than a whisper, she heard it, coming from upstairs, muffled by distance and the storm, the fragile sound of a lullaby. With a new kind of calm, a certainty that came from instinct, she moved. She crossed the ballroom, dodging the silhouettes of guests huddled around the emergency lights. She ascended the grand marble staircase, the cold steps beneath the soles of her worn shoes. The melody grew a little clearer with each step, a thread of wool guiding her out of the labyrinth. She followed the sound down the dark corridor, past the closed doors of guest rooms, until she reached that door, the office, the door where it all began. She pushed it open gently. The scene inside was a repetition, and at the same time, an inversion of the first time. Arthur was in the same leather armchair, yes, and Leo was safe in his lap, his eyes sleepy. But this time, Arthur was awake. He was looking out the large window, where the rain lashed against the glass and tree branches danced a furious jig. The room was silent, except for the lullaby he murmured and the sound of the storm. He turned when she entered, and there was no surprise in his eyes, only a deep and infinite melancholy. "I heard him crying in the hallway," he said, his voice low, almost an apology. "He was scared of the dark." Eliana stood still in the doorway, her heart finally calming. "That song," she began, the question dying on her lips. Arthur looked at Leo's sleeping face, his thumb caressing the boy's soft cheek. "I didn't learn it in any expensive private school," he said, and for the first time, the barrier between them seemed to dissolve. "After a very difficult separation, many years ago, I lost custody of my own son. It was an unfair legal battle, full of lies. I was young. I didn't have the power or the fortune I have today to fight." He paused, swallowing hard. "I sank, and the person who took care of me, who stopped me from giving up on everything, was an old woman, Mrs. Ramirez. She was the cook at the cheap boarding house where I went to live. She sang that same song to her grandson, and she sang it to me too when she thought I wasn't listening. She said that certain pains only time and lullabies can soothe." The confession hung in the air, fragile and powerful. "I built this wall around me, Eliana. This coldness, this distance, it's so I don't break inside again, so I don't feel what I felt when they took my boy away." In that instant, Eliana didn't see the billionaire, the owner of the estate, the man whose net worth exceeded that of a small nation. She saw a heartbroken father, a man haunted by a loss that no amount of money could repair. A loud click sounded in the corridor, followed by a growing hum. The mansion lights flickered violently and then returned with full force, flooding the office with a dazzling clarity that broke the spell of that moment. The door burst open. Mrs. Albright stood in the doorway, her face a mask of righteous fury. Behind her, Veronica, with a cruel smile. "Mr. Arthur," the housekeeper thundered, her voice echoing through the newly restored silence. "A disaster has occurred. The silverware, it's all stained. This woman, she destroyed it with the wrong product." The moment of vulnerability shattered like glass. Mrs. Albright's accusation, loud and theatrical, cut through the office air, bringing the cold, calculating world of the mansion back with full force. Veronica, standing behind the housekeeper, was already making a discreet gesture to her press aide, who approached with a cell phone in hand, ready to record the serious failure that would justify everything. Arthur's face instantly closed, the mask of coldness returning to place like a vault door, slamming shut. He looked at Eliana, then at the silverware that a waiter, at Albright's command, brought in on a tray. There were dark, dull stains on some of the pieces. Clearly damaged, the trap, finally, had revealed itself in its totality. Eliana felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. For an instant, fear paralyzed her. The scene was exactly as Veronica had planned. Public humiliation, forged evidence, the impossibility of defense. She looked at Arthur's face, searching for a glimpse of the man who had opened his heart to her moments before, but found only the calculating billionaire. Assessing the damage to his heirloom and his image, the weight of injustice, however, was stronger than fear. The memory of her son's cry, the exhaustion of the long walks in the rain, the dignity she had fought so hard to uphold, all united in a wave of silent strength. Trembling, but with a determination she didn't know she possessed, Eliana stepped forward. "That's not true," she said, her voice low but firm, making everyone in the corridor turn to her. She didn't look at her accusers, but directly at Arthur. She pulled her cell phone from her apron pocket. "The day your wallet went missing, the first-floor cameras were under maintenance. Mrs. Albright said it was impossible to know what had happened." With a trembling finger, she opened her photo gallery and displayed the image of the maintenance log page. This proves the cameras were off, and this, she opened the shaky video from the supplier, shows Mrs. Albright tampering with my cleaning cart on that exact day. A murmur rippled through the small group that had formed in the corridor. Mrs. Albright paled. That proves nothing. It's absurd. But Eliana didn't stop. Her heart pounded uncontrollably against her ribs. But she continued, driven by weeks of contained humiliation. And about the silverware. She paused, her eyes meeting Veronica's. I have other proof. It was then that she took the small baby monitor receiver from her other pocket. She pressed play. Veronica's voice, hissing and unmistakable, echoed through the tense silence of the corridor. I'll offer you a generous sum. Think of it as a dividend for your loyalty. The silverware. You will publicly accuse her of having used the wrong product. In front of everyone, he will have no choice but to fire her. The silence that followed was absolute. Veronica's face contorted into a mask of fury and shock. Mrs. Albright seemed to have shrunk, her eyes wide with terror. The press aide slowly lowered his phone. The mansion's security chief, who had approached to see the commotion, cleared his throat. The audio is clean, and I can confirm the authenticity of that notation in the maintenance log. My employee made it. The house's HR manager, a discreet man who always stayed in the background, stepped forward. Mr. Arthur, house rules are clear. Documented evidence overrides any verbal accusation. All eyes turned to Arthur. He stood motionless, his face indecipherable. Leo, woken by the noise, clung to his shirt, scared. The decision he made there, in front of his guests, his partners, and the press, would define not only Eliana's future, but his own. Would he be the cold billionaire who protected his assets at all costs, or the man who honored the memory of his carpenter grandfather? The night, the storm, the future of everyone in that room, everything seemed to hold its breath, waiting for his next word. The silence in the corridor was so dense, it seemed to have weight and form. Arthur looked at the recording in Eliana's hand, then at Veronica's livid face, and, finally, at Mrs. Albright, who was visibly trembling. The mask of coldness on his face did not crumble, but something in his eyes shifted. There was a cutting clarity, the resolve of a man who finally sees the entire board and decides to flip the game. He slowly rose, adjusting Leo in his arm, and walked to the center of the small circle of onlookers. His movement was the signal for reality to resettle. "The deal is off, Veronica," he said, his voice calm, but with an edge of steel no one there had ever heard. There was no anger, just the finality of a vault door closing. "My foundation will not be built on lies and cruelty. The image you wanted to sell doesn't interest me. You can inform your partners that their investment is no longer welcome." The shock on Veronica's face was profound. She opened her mouth to protest, to argue about profits, dividends, and contracts, but the words died before they were born. She had lost control, her most precious asset. Without a word, she turned and walked briskly down the corridor, the sound of her heels on the marble echoing like hammer blows. Next, Arthur turned to Mrs. Albright. "Mrs. Albright, you have served this house for many years," he began, and for an instant the housekeeper seemed to have a spark of hope. "But loyalty is no excuse for a lack of integrity. You used your position to humiliate and sabotage an employee, risking not only her well-being, but the assets you swore to protect. Consider your contract terminated for cause. The security team will escort you to your quarters." The housekeeper wilted, the last vestiges of her authority crumbling to dust. Two discreet figures in suits escorted her down the corridor, ending a reign of fear and order. The tension in the air began to dissipate, replaced by a murmur of astonishment and relief among the other employees who watched from afar. Arthur then did something no one expected. In front of everyone, journalists, guests, and his staff, he turned to Eliana. "Eliana," he said, and for the first time he called her by name in front of other people. I owe you an apology. I put you in a position of intolerable vulnerability. I allowed the rules of this house, rules I myself created to protect myself, to be used as weapons against you. I failed to protect you, and for that, I am truly sorry." The sincerity in his voice was undeniable. It was the confession of a man who recognized not only the mistake, but his own weakness. He took a deep breath and continued, his voice now louder, projected for all to hear. "Tonight, part of the funds that would have been allocated to image agreements will be redirected. It will be entirely donated for the complete and immediate renovation of the neighborhood daycare where Eliana and her son come from." The announcement was like a shockwave, a public declaration of his new values. It was a gesture that cost him millions in investments, but one that reconciled him with the memory of his carpenter grandfather, with the man he wanted to be. The climax of the night, however, wasn't the grand announcement one, but what happened next. Arthur approached Eliana, little Leo still in his lap, now looking at his mother with curious eyes. "I can't erase what happened," Arthur said, his voice low again, just for her. "But I can try to make amends. I would like to offer you a direct employment contract with my company, no longer as a contractor. With a better, fairer salary, and with the guarantee of a spot for Leo at the partner daycare, the foundation will now fund." It wasn't a declaration of love. There was no triumphant kiss. There was something much more real and profound. He extended his free hand. Eliana looked at his hand, then at his face, and saw there, finally, the man behind the armor. She shook his hand. They were two trembling hands, hers marked by work, his by the weight of fortune, that touched with respect and the silent promise of something new, something that might, perhaps, slowly bloom. 3 weeks after the stormy night, the morning sun streamed through Eliana's kitchen window, warming the smell of fresh coffee and buttered toast. The rain seemed a distant memory, an ordeal that had washed the world clean and new. Her morning routine had transformed. There was no more cold, slippery walk in the dark. Now, she and Leo walked the few blocks to the daycare together under the sun, hand in hand. The building, once grey and cracked, was covered in scaffolding, but the facade already sported a vibrant new coat of yellow paint. The sound of hammering and the smell of new wood were the soundtrack of hope. When she left Leo at the gate, he no longer cried, but ran into the arms of one of the teachers, excited about the improvised playground they had set up in the back, away from the construction. For the first time in a long time, Eliana went to work with a light heart, free from the weight of anxiety and uncertainty. The atmosphere in the mansion was also different. The silence that was once oppressive was now peaceful. With Mrs. Albright's departure, a new, kinder and fairer housekeeper had been hired. The fear and distrust that permeated the corridors had dissipated, replaced by an air of professionalism and mutual respect. The other employees no longer looked at her with pity or suspicion, but with silent admiration. She was no longer the invisible cleaner, the disposable piece. She was Eliana, the woman who had faced power with truth and won. Her job was the same, but she performed it with new dignity, her head held high, knowing that her worth had finally been recognized. The wealth of that house no longer intimidated her. She saw the expensive objects not as symbols of an unattainable world, but for what they were, just things. One afternoon, while tending to the flowers on the veranda overlooking the garden, Arthur approached. He wasn't wearing his usual formal suit, but a simple shirt, and he carried in his hands not a business report, but 2 glasses of juice. He offered her one, and they stood there, side by side, looking out at the city spread below them. "I was at the daycare this morning," he said, breaking the comfortable silence. "The new kitchen windows arrived, and the children painted a rainbow on the playground wall." He smiled, a genuine, unarmored smile. "One of the boys asked me if I was the Uncle Fix-It. I guess that's a promotion." That simple comment, that genuine joy with something so small, revealed the depth of his transformation. He was learning to measure his wealth not in stocks or dollars, but in smiles and colors on a wall. They didn't speak much more. They didn't need to. In that shared silence, there was an understanding that words could not express. There was her gratitude, his respect, and the promise of a future where the distance between their two worlds was no longer an abyss, but just a space that could be filled with kindness and humanity. Eliana looked at the horizon, at the sun beginning to set, painting the sky with warm colors. Life, she thought, was like that mansion. Sometimes it took a great storm to tear down the walls, extinguish the lights, and force everyone to see what truly matters in the dark. And sometimes a heart everyone believed was stone didn't need to break to transform, but merely to find the right melody to open and let the light in.